So in June, I feel like I exceeded everybody's expectations of myself, including my own, because I don't know how this happened. I didn't realize until the end of the month, but June has become my second best reading month of 2024 so far. Now, I only read 10 books, which I know is a considerable amount, but over the last few months, I've read 10 books every month. So that is kind of what I'm coming to expect for myself. I am nothing if not consistent, but I guess the books that I read this month were considerably larger than the 10 books that I read in May, which resulted in a higher number of pages, which is how I rank my best months of the year. My best everything really. Page count is more valuable to me than the amount of physical books that I read. But we're just gonna get into these stats for this video, I guess, so we can jump into the reviews. So in the month of June, I read a total of 4,357 pages across 10 books, which breaks down to an average of 145 pages per day, which is quite high for me. I'm more like a 100 to 110 page per day kind of girl. For the star ratings, it was actually a good month in terms of ratings. I gave 2 2-stars, 4 3-stars, and 4 4-stars, which breaks down to an average of 3.2 stars per book. For the demographics, I just read 1 young adult novel and 9 adult. For the format, 6 of them were standardly formatted novels. I read 2 ebooks, listened to 1 audiobook, and I finished off the month with 1 novella. For the genres, I read a lot of romance-oriented books in June. So I read 3 fantasy, 3 fantasy romance, 2 romance, 1 horror, and 1 mystery. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 5 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024. 2 of them I read on Kindle Unlimited, 2 were from my library, and 1 is a book that I have hauled this year. So jumping straight into those reviews, the first book that I read was one of the KU ones, and it was my Patreon book club book for technically the month of May, but I read it right at the end of May, kind of going into June, and that was Daughter of No Worlds by Carissa Broadbent. So we are currently reading through the War of Lost Hearts series, and let me tell you, I am very excited to be getting into book 2 in July, because I gave this one 4 stars. I loved it. So this one is following a young woman who is a slave, and right at the beginning of this book, she buys her way out of slavery, and she makes her way to this city that has a order. I still can't remember whether they're magicians or sorcerers, but they're magic wielders. The reason why she does this is because she's left her friend behind in slavery, and she would like to learn how to control the magical abilities that she has so that she can go back and save him and maybe take a couple of members of the order with her to help her out. And when she arrives at this order of magic wielders, she's a little bit late in the year, so to join them she has to complete an apprenticeship, and the only person available is this fire sorcerer who is also a big recluse called Max, and he very reluctantly takes Tasana under his wing, and a friendship and kind of romance blossoms between them throughout the course of the book. And along the way as well, a big part of this is corruption within institutions and government, and Tasana is learning that where the place she's come from is terrible, potentially just because the place where she is better than the place that she's come from. It's not the good place that she assumed that it was at the beginning. So I got into this immediately. I really loved it. Carissa Broadbent is compared to Sarah J Maas a lot, and I definitely see that comparison, and I definitely see how this series has been compared to Throne of Glass. Now there are lots of big differences. I wouldn't necessarily say that the series are similar at all. It's more the pacing and the kind of structure of the story that reminded me of Throne of Glass more than anything. My favorite thing about this book was the romance between the 2 characters. I liked that it was a slow burn. It reminded me a lot of the main romance that we have in the Crescent City series by Sarah J Maas, because we start off very slowly building the foundations of friendship and trust before anything romantic blossoms. I also really loved a big difference between Carissa Broadbent and Sarah J Maas is that we don't have any miscommunication tropes in here. The main characters really do communicate to each other. I really love that. It felt like a breath of fresh air, because I feel like in romantic fiction, a real easy thing to do is have those characters miscommunicate to create some tension in the relationship, and it was just really refreshing not to see that here. On top of that, I do think that Carissa Broadbent did a really good job with the world building and the atmosphere, which really kept me hooked in this story, and I'm very excited to continue on to book 2 in July. Next up, I read a contemporary romance that I both didn't like but also found very entertaining, which is definitely a theme for the contemporary romance that I read this month, and that was My Dark Romeo by Parker S. Huntington and LJ Shen. Now I went into this knowing that it was kind of going to be toxic and angsty, and it definitely delivered on that. This is following a billionaire that goes to a debutante ball, and he asks this girl if she wants to hook up with him, and she's like, oh my god, like, yeah, sure, let's go, you're stunning, I'm down. So they go out into the gardens or whatever, and he intentionally exposes to the rest of the people at this party, including her family, that they're hooking up, which is a big deal because she's this like pure innocent girl from a southern family in a small town. So this billionaire then convinces her dad that because he has besmirched her honor, they have to get married. And it just so happens that our main character is actually already engaged. It's an arranged match that has been arranged for her entire life, and her current fiance is this billionaire's sworn enemy, like his arch nemesis. So essentially he's orchestrated this entire thing to get back at this guy. She ends up having to marry him, she moves in with him, and they really do dislike each other. Romeo, who is the love interest, has no interest in her at all, aside from to kind of achieve these ends, and he has this long goal of kind of just like using her and discarding her, and she is kind of trying to make the best of her situation because all she wants is to be a mother, she wants a family. And on the flip side of that, the one thing that Romeo will not do is have children because he wants his father's legacy to die with him. And if you think that that sounds like the plot of the first Bridgerton book, then you would be very correct. So imagine like the plot of Bridgerton in Gossip Girl, and you kind of have this book. It is like super toxic Gossip Girl kind of energy, and the Romeo especially, but both of them are extremely unhinged. Unhinged is the best way to describe this book. The smut was interesting. It was interesting in some parts. Do not take any safe sex advice from this couple, let me just tell you that, because it will not get you very far. It's not going to get you very far. And the love interest was just an awful person. And I really thought that throughout the course of this book, it was going to be her making him better. This guy, as well as being a billionaire, he makes his money by arming third world countries because it's lucrative. And I thought that we would get to a point where she's kind of, because she doesn't agree with it, so I thought we'd get to a point where she convinces him that that's not a good thing to do, but we never really got there. So if you want to go in for the entertainment factor of this one, it was definitely very entertaining, but also terrible. Like, it was awful, but I had a good time and I gave it 2 stars. Next, I moved on to my iconic Bookopoly Shelf It or Scrap It crossover, which I will link if you have yet to check it out. But the first book that was selected for that was Glow by Raven Kennedy, which is the 4th book in the Plated Prisoner series. So this one is a fantasy romance series that is a retelling of the King Midas myth, following Auron, who is King Midas's most favored pet. She is madly in love with him, and he keeps her in a cage in his palace. But wait, because she actually wants to be there. She's in the cage by choice, because when she was growing up, when she was younger, until she met Midas and reached this point, she was treated terribly by everybody that she encountered, and so she sees this cage in Midas's palace as a place of safety for her, and she chooses to live in captivity almost. So the kind of changing point for this story is that Midas has decided that he wants to conquer a neighboring territory, and while he is moving into that territory to set up base, he takes all of his prized possessions, all of his favored saddles with him, including Auron, and the traveling caravan is set upon by raiders, and Auron and her companions get kidnapped, which really forces Auron to stand on her own for the first time in a very long time and kind of face her fears. So it's really hard to talk about this series because the point that I'm currently at book 4, at the end of book 4, is so different from where we started in book 1. And one of my favorite things about this series is that you go into it with a set of expectations that are immediately challenged. That eventually obviously evolves into something more, which is more to do with the plot of book 4 than that initial setup that I just told you. But if I'm being honest, I want you to read this series for yourself, so I'm not going to give anything away. But what I really did love about this is the downtime that we got between our 2 main characters, because we haven't had a lot of one-on-one time with them since, I want to say, like book 2, and this book was very slow. It was a very slow build, but we did get that valuable kind of character building time. They worked out some issues. Something really traumatic happens to our characters at the end of book 3, which they are working through. One of them in particular is really struggling to get over this, and the other one like also kind of feels some way about it. So I love that we really took the time for that character development and growth, and I do just generally really like the characters, the atmosphere, the writing in this series. I did give this one 4 stars, but I will say that the end of this is 5-star material, and it's is always the way with indie fantasy romance, and I know that this is traditionally published now, but it was indie. We have like this slow build where seemingly not a lot happens that goes into this like 5-star worthy climax that we only kind of resolve in the next book. It's the same with Jennifer L. Armentrout, even though I don't really read her anymore. So I am desperate to go into book 5. I'm really happy that I managed to get back into this series, because with it being traditionally published and me no longer being able to get matching editions of it, it really did put me off continuing this series for a while. So I'm really happy that Shelve It or Scrap It forced me to get back into it. A book that I really expected to love but sadly did not is A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle L. Jensen. And I have read from Danielle L. Jensen before. I've read the first 2 books in the Bridge Kingdom series and I loved them. And I've also heard very, very good things about this one. So having this book be by an author that I've previously enjoyed and heard positive things, I thought this was going to be an instant win for me. And it wasn't. It wasn't. So this one is following a young woman who is the Shield Maiden. It's inspired by Norse mythology, and she has been blessed by a goddess with this power of like creating a shield. So she's married to this guy that she hates, and one day this guy goes to the Jarl and the Jarl puts our main character Freya, into a fight to the death. Now the person that he picks to go against her is his son, who is also blessed by the gods to have these amazing skills in battle and wield a flaming axe. So she has no hope in hell of winning, and when she's got her back against the wall, when she knows that she's gonna die in this fight, she summons this shield that nobody knows that she has. And the reason why she's kept this hidden is because her father always warned her to, but the reason why her father warned her is because there is this prophecy that whoever controls the Shield Maiden will become the King of Scarland. So this Jarl finds the Shield Maiden, forces him to marry her, and starts upon this journey to become the King of Scarland and unite all of the Jarldoms, are they called? And he makes his son protect Freya so that she doesn't come to any harm during this process, so that the prophecy can be fulfilled. And obviously it is a romance between, because we gotta have some romance in here, it is between the main character Freya and the son of the Jarl, Bjorn, who can't be together because she's married to his dad. So, like I said, I previously really enjoyed Danielle L. Jensen. I did like the writing in here, and I did like the atmosphere. I don't think that I love stories inspired by Norse mythology. Like, the vibe is not something that I'm particularly drawn to, and I did definitely feel that with this one. I do, even though I didn't love this book, I do see why a lot of other people really love it, especially when it comes to the pacing. As we all know, I love really slow books that really get into the nitty-gritty, as opposed to like high action fun plots. And I do think that this struck a perfect middle ground between the two. It wasn't all go, all action, but at the same time we had regular points of action to kind of keep the pace going throughout this story. And I don't think that we necessarily sacrificed character development for the sake of the plot. That being said, I was not as attached to the characters as I wanted to be in this story. I didn't really get behind the romance because of that. I felt like there was a lot of telling and not showing from the point of the main character in this. It is just a single perspective book. I understand why it isn't dual perspective, but I feel like in terms of story immersion, I would have really benefited from a dual POV in this one, because I felt like I was just being told by the main character everything that she felt, and I wasn't really seeing how she felt based on the interactions that these two have, because she thinks that he's into her, he's flirting with her. But going into this, like, we know that this guy is a ladies' man, so I feel like in her position, based on the interactions that I saw between them, I kind of would just go into this assuming that he's a nice guy and a little bit of a flirt, but she was kind of seeing this as a little bit more and kind of falling for him in response to that, when I felt like the signs weren't really there, and I only believed in the depth of this relationship because she told me to, not because I felt it, if that makes sense. So that was my main kind of critique of this. I do genuinely think that a lot of people will really love this. I just wasn't really immersed in it in a way that I could rate it any higher than 3 stars. On the flip side of that, one that I did not expect to enjoy, and actually I really liked this book, that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. And I am still so surprised by this one because the synopsis of this book is so unappealing to me. I only have a copy of this book because it came in the adult fairy loot and also the Illumicrate at the time, which I'm a rep for both of them. I never ever would have gone out of my way to buy this book because I just did not think that I would enjoy it at all. And I ended up giving it 4 stars. So this book is predominantly about colonialism and racism, discrimination and prejudice within institutions such as Oxford University, and kind of not the roots of racism, but the effect that colonialism had on our society and still has on our society, with a kind of look at when the British Empire was at its highest, and the way that some of the instances displayed in this book are still things somewhat faced by people today. In terms of this being a story, we are following a boy called Robin who was taken from the Canton region of China by a professor, and he was taken to London. He was raised as the ward of this professor because the magic system in this world relies on silver and engraving silver blocks. So if you have two words that kind of mean the same, the magic will fill in the gap in between to create the magical power like what it does. Now I know that sounds really complicated, but essentially the reason why this professor needs Robin is because you have to be really good at languages to be able to do this. You have to be fluent in a language that isn't English in a way where you deeply understand the language. And Robin, being from China, has this knowledge, this fluency of Mandarin that people who are not from China do not have. So this professor takes him, and when he's old enough, he enrolls him into Oxford, where he joins Babel, which is the translation school. And as soon as he arrives, he faces a lot of prejudice himself, but he does also make friends with an Indian boy and a black girl, and then the fourth member of their group is a white girl as well, at a time when women are not especially allowed to enroll in Oxford, and people of colour are definitely not. It's only for the purpose of translation that they have been allowed into this university. So Robin himself is white passing, but not only does he face some prejudice, he also sees a great deal of prejudice aimed at his darker skinned companions. And throughout the course of this, he's kind of questioning what he knows from growing up in England under this professor and all of this kind of discrimination that he is facing. And he's essentially having his eyes open to the way that the people around him are using him. So I enjoyed this book in terms of it being a story, but I really did not appreciate the way that R.F. Kuang was smacking me over the head with the point in this book. There are footnotes in this story, and some of them are just like translations, which I gotta say I didn't understand the relevance of some of the translations because they're in languages that I don't speak. But other translations were kind of over explaining the point. Like there's one point, I think it's on like page 26, where Robin essentially, like you can tell, like it's inferred in the text from like the 30 pages that you've read, that the professor that is raising Robin does not care about his heritage and does not care about taking parts of Robin's heritage from himself. And it is already inferred by the text that the reason why Robin is studying Mandarin or continuing to speak in Mandarin occasionally and not Cantonese is because no white people of value of note find any value in Cantonese. That is very obvious from the 25 or so pages you've already read. But then you have a footnote explaining that. And I'm like, I just don't need this. Like, I feel like the beauty of books like this is making people feel uncomfortable, which this does. It really holds a mirror to the reader. And some of the scenes in this book are designed to kind of shock you in that way and confront you to kind of face your own beliefs that maybe you didn't realize that you held because of things like systemic racism. And I think that the beauty of books like this is that it's supposed to hold that mirror to the reader, but then the reader is supposed to be able to figure out for themselves why they feel uncomfortable. I feel like people learn a lot more when they have to come to that conclusion themselves than when they're being told. And in my opinion, like this book does not have a lot of room for independent thought, and it doesn't encourage discussion because every moment there is a scene of discrimination or there is like a racial slur or a slight against any of our main characters, there is either a footnote or a scene where all of the characters get together and they talk about how racist that scene just was. And I know that it's racist. I read the book. I'm reading the book. I can see what's happening. I don't need you then to explain to me what that scene meant. Like, I'm supposed to, based on how good your writing is, I'm supposed to be able to figure that out for myself. And that is the thing that I didn't really love about this book. I felt like Rebecca Kuang was in this book with me. I felt like she was a omniscient, omnipresent character that you could just not get away from. But aside from that, I did really love this. I love the atmosphere. I really liked the writing. and I have read The Poppy War and I didn't like it because I thought that it wasn't very well written. So something that did really surprise me about this is that I enjoyed the writing so much. So this is the reason why we do things like shelve it or scrap it, and I don't just unhaul things because I assume I'm going to dislike them, because sometimes you think you're gonna hate something and you end up giving it 4 stars. Once again, a book that I thought that I was really going to enjoy that I turned out not to love so much. This one was highly anticipated for me for a long time. Like, I've had this on my shelf a long time thinking that I'm gonna love it. So I was really sad to give Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia 3 stars. Now, the interesting thing about this, actually reading it straight after Babel, is that this also touches on, well, it doesn't just touch on colonialism. A big theme throughout the story is colonialism, and it also actually touches upon the silverworking industry and silver mining, which is a big part of the setup on like the history of Babel. And I did think that that was a really interesting coincidence. But this is following a young woman called Noemi who receives a letter from her cousin, or her father receives a letter from her cousin, saying that her cousin's husband is poisoning her. So her father is a little bit worried because before they got married, he didn't really get to know this husband very well. So he sends his daughter, who is a socialite, to this not abandoned but very secluded manor house where her cousin now lives to get to the bottom of kind of what's happening to her. So she arrives there, and the family that she meets are scary. Like, they are very aloof, they very much keep to themselves, they're very strict in their ways, and Noemi immediately just does not like this house that she is in and the people within it. And as the story goes on, everyone kind of gets a little bit more sinister, and she's also being plagued by these very bizarre nightmares. Now, I did like the atmosphere in here. I've actually heard, back when this was released, I feel a lot of people saying that they didn't feel like this was horror. And I'm very confused about that, because one thing that I will say that is positive about this is that it is horror. Like, it is horrific, and the further that you get into this book, the more horrific it kind of gets. And I do feel like, in terms of it being a horror, in terms of it being scary, it does definitely deliver on that. I didn't love that the first part of this book was so slow. It reminded me a lot of The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi that I've just read. Like, I think I read that in May, where you have this very slow build, and I was kind of bored throughout the beginning of both of them, that eventually kind of comes to something in the last like 50 to 100 pages. Like, you kind of get that payoff. Now, in this, I didn't particularly like the payoff, and I'm not going to tell you guys what type of horror this book is, but I went into this expecting it to be more of a Gothic suspense, and it has a very kind of like common horror subgenre slash trope that forms the main horror element of this book that I had no idea about going into it. And if I had known about it, I would have definitely been a lot more dubious about picking up this book, because it is an element of horror that I am not interested in. I'm not interested in. It massively gives me the ick, and is definitely not something, like, if I found a book that was this type of horror, I wouldn't pick it up. So I didn't end up liking this book, mainly because of that element. When I kind of found out where this was going, I was like, not for me, not for me, don't want to be here. But in terms of it being scary, unsettling, and a horror, I feel like it really did deliver, which is why I did give it 3 stars. It just wasn't a very enjoyable read for me at all, and I did really struggle to get through it because I wasn't having a good time with it. I then picked up my second KU book of the month, which was Flock by Kate Stewart. This one was my Patreon pick for June, and I went into it kind of with an open mind. I felt like the synopsis was giving absolutely nothing. The only thing I knew going into it is that it was a reverse harem, or like why choose romance, which typically is not my favorite, but I also knew there was going to be some sort of mystery element in here, which I feel kind of really carried me through the book. So this one is following a girl who, to unlock her trust fund, she has to live with her dad and work at his factory for a year to kind of learn the business before she theoretically eventually takes over after her father has passed away. So she has to do this between leaving high school and going to college, and on her first day on the job, she meets this boy called Sean, who she very quickly becomes infatuated with, and it very quickly becomes apparent that he is involved with something kind of mysterious that he will not tell her about. And at this time, she's also getting close to his friendship group. And like I said, it is a reverse harem slash why choose, so you can kind of see where that is going. Now, I typically do not like reverse harem or why choose romances because I just feel like it's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. As somebody who really loves a slow burn, I feel like having to go through getting to know multiple different love interests and then having to read that relationship building, and then this one in particular is very smutty, so you have almost twice the amount of sex scenes that you would have originally, and I feel like for me it does just get a little bit tedious and repetitive. It feels like I'm kind of reading two standalone contemporary romances at the same time, and I just don't enjoy it. I don't. This one was a little bit different because I felt like we did have a little bit of a slower build with some of the relationships. Now, I did give this one 3 stars and I have started the sequel. I do think I'm going to DNF it because I'm actually not that invested. I'm not as invested as I thought I was, but I do feel like what I've read of the sequel so far, which admittedly is only like 3 chapters, that we're going to get more kind of men involved in this situation as well. So you are very slowly introduced to the love interests that are going to be present in this series. I did enjoy it a little bit more than some why choose romances I've read because of that, but I still didn't love it. You know, the mystery element did keep me hooked a little bit, but I don't feel like it's a mystery that's like very cleverly revealed to you. Like, I don't feel like you are curious about what is going on because of the strength of the writing, because it's a very well built mystery. You're actually intrigued about the mystery elements of this book because there are big gaping holes in the plot that the author has left there so that you intentionally don't know what's happening. So you have to keep reading to find out what's happening because the good stuff has kind of been omitted. I also, based on what I've read so far, I don't feel like the mystery is going to satisfy me. Like, I don't think it's something that's worth reading this trilogy for me. Mainly because the first book is almost 400 pages, the second is almost 500, and the third is almost 600. And something that I did really like about this is that it had the writing style of like those angsty, wildly unrealistic romances that I love, like Colleen Hoover and Penelope Douglas. So for that reason, I kind of ate it up. It was a very easy read, very compelling, but actually thinking about it, I don't really care much for the plot or the characters. And so while I started the sequel because it was an easy thing to do, and I kind of haven't put it down yet because it's easy to kind of just read a chapter before bed every night and not think about it, I actually don't really care for this series very much, so I don't think I will be continuing. In terms of like why choose romances, I think it is the most interesting one that I've read, but I just truly do not think that there is a way that that trope can be done that works for me, unfortunately. Talking about dissatisfying books, I also finally finished Winter's Heart by Robert Jordan. I have been reading this for the entire month of June. I did miss the live show for it for Wheel of Time along because, I mean, there were very many reasons why I ended up missing that live show, but part of it is that I just struggled through this book so hard. If you don't know what Wheel of Time is about, there's very little that I can tell you apart from kind of like the basic overview that I give, which is this is a classic epic fantasy series that is a struggle between the forces of dark and light. Everything that's happened in this world is something that's happened before, and with every age the same events repeat. And in this series we are following this age's dragon reborn as he is traditionally a pawn between the forces of light and dark. Hopefully this time around he's going to tip the world towards the light for good, or at least for the rest of this age, I guess. But this one, I did not love the first half to 3/4 of this, and because of that I just really struggled with motivation throughout. I thought that it had a very slow start. I now kind of understand why a lot of people are tired of Perrin, which is really sad because up until this point, I think for the first maybe 3 or 4 books he was my favorite character, and I feel like his arc has ended almost. And so every time we revisit him now, I'm kind of unimpressed, unenthused, a little bit bored of what I'm kind of reading. And by the time we got to the good perspective, which I would say in this book is Matt, I was just struggling so hard with this book that getting the energy, the enthusiasm to continue was just so difficult. And in terms of like integral parts of the series that happen in this book, I think we have one very important thing that happens in like the last 50 pages, and then 2 or 3 things of note happen in this one. So for me to struggle through it for so long for that was kind of just disheartening. So I feel like, I don't know if this is actually genuinely the worst book in this series that I've read so far, but I feel like it is the one that was hardest for me to read. I did give it 2 stars, so it is one of the lowest ratings in the series so far, but I have given other installments 2 stars, and I have already started book 10. I'm still in the prologue, which is 3.5 hours in audio, but I have started book 10, and I'm hoping that because it's the start of a new book, I can kind of regather some enthusiasm for this one, because I am committed to seeing this story through to the end. I am just very much feeling the slog era in Wheel of Time right now. I did also continue on with my read through of the Pretty Little Liars series by Sarah Shepard in June with book number 4, which is Unbelievable. This one is a YA mystery series about a group of girls who are receiving threatening text messages after their friend has gone missing, and so they kind of band together to get to the bottom of who is blackmailing them. This one is the end of a story arc. I believe the Pretty Little Liars series is broken down into 4-book story arcs, and with that in mind, I was a little bit disappointed in this one. I've given previous installments in this series 4 stars. There is so much wrong with them, but they are so entertaining and not badly written, which is what I initially assumed going into this. I find them so compelling, so entertaining, and so nostalgic in the way that they're set in like the early to mid 2000s. This one, I felt like the characters were just being extra annoying. Arya doesn't need a perspective in this book because nothing that she is doing with her kind of personal life that ties into what she's being blackmailed about is relevant to this plot that's happening right now, and she's kind of off doing her own thing, worrying about things that aren't relevant right now, while everybody else is deeply ingrained in like the climax of this story arc. So yeah, I felt like the awfulness of some of the main characters was really ramped up, especially on the part of like Emily. Spencer seems to be kind of getting more and more out of control with every book, and Hannah was fabulous as always. No, she definitely had her flaws in this book, but I am nothing if not a Hannah stan. Okay, so yeah, this one was still enjoyable, but I don't feel like it was as good as the earlier books in the series, or especially books 1 and 3 I think are my favorites so far. So I did give this one a 3-star rating. I am still continuing though. I'm having a very good time with these. And then to round out the month, I finished with a novella. So the one that I read was included in The Arcanum Unbounded by Brandon Sanderson, which is a bind up of short stories and novellas related to the Cosmere. And the one in particular that I read is Mistborn: A Secret History, which is tied to the Mistborn series obviously, but it is in reading order. You should read it before Stormlight. So I have obviously already read the first 3 Stormlight books, but I'm about to start rereading them hopefully. So this time around I wanted to check out this novella, and I've got to be real, I can't tell you anything about it. I can tell you one thing. I have an option of what I can tell you. I can't tell you both at the same time because then they would be spoilers. So I think the one that I'm gonna go with, which is the only thing that I can tell you about this book, is that it follows Kelsia, who is a main character of the first Mistborn trilogy. I enjoyed the first half of this novella more than I enjoyed the second, but then I also enjoyed the earlier days of Mistborn more than I enjoyed the end days, so maybe there's like some correlation there. And I thought that we got some really interesting information in this novella. I do have to question though why it was included, because Brandon Sanderson, notorious for really good foreshadowing, really good Easter eggs, really good plotting, and you really have to work to put together a lot of the information in the Cosmere. And in this novella, I just feel like it was really handed to us. Like a lot of information that we've been piecing together for quite some time was kind of just given over to the reader. And I also think that a novella was a really odd place for me for that information to be contained, because I feel like it was so interesting and so important that I would have liked it in a core installment of the Cosmere as opposed to a novella. Now, having read the first 3 books in the Stormlight archive, I can kind of see where some of these things are coming into play and tying back to things that we learn in this novella, but I do think it's weird, especially going into Stormlight, which is very intentionally ambiguous to start off with. I feel like it's interesting that we have a lot of this information given to us before Stormlight even begins. I also feel like due to the timeline of this book, I would have potentially preferred this to be merged with core installments of the Cosmere instead of put in its own little novella, and especially because it's been so long since I've read Mistborn, especially like the first 3 Mistborn books, I feel like that definitely would have been beneficial as well to read these little moments alongside the core part of the plot, as opposed to reading it separately like so many books after some of these events do take place. I am very excited to get back into Stormlight now though, because I just miss Brandon Sanderson and I miss the Cosmere, and especially in this book as well, it was really nice to see Kelsier, who was one of my favorite characters. This has also very sadly made me want to reread Mistborn Era 2, which is something that I said I would never do. I still have 1 book left to read, which is The Lost Metal, and I definitely think I'm going to come away from the audiobooks and read that one physically to really get into those little Cosmere Easter eggs. But yeah, I will brave wax and wane this one time to read The Lost Metal. I just don't think I can do a reread, guys. I just don't think I can do it. I hate that series so much. But yeah, I did make, like I said in my June TBR, I made a baby step towards continuing on with the Cosmere and restarting my reread of the Stormlight archive. Hopefully in July I will be able to get through at least Way of Kings Part 1. That is my new goal. My July TBR though, if you haven't seen it, is massive, so I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I'm choosing to be delulu about it. So that was my June wrap up. Down in my comments, let me know if you've read any of these books and what you guys thought of them, and also let me know what your favorite book that you read in June was. If you would like to let me know that you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me any blue emoji for Mistborn. Aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Patreon if you'd like to join me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're ready to go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.